Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. Hey, real quick, before we get to today's episode, be sure to hit subscribe. You can do it right now. It's the best way to make sure you never miss an episode of the Pacesetter Pod and any of the great content or conversations that we publish right to your podcast player of choice every Wednesday. Now, for today's episode, I want to talk about diversification. Diversification is a word that we hear a lot about in agribusiness, and diversification itself is arguably a strategy or a meaningful tactic to advance a larger strategy. But what I fear and what I see regularly is that diversification is not universally understood, not in the terms of how it drives better outcomes, nor even more importantly, in some of the risks that are involved in getting it wrong. One of the main ways that I see this show up is in the ag cooperative system. Many of the co-ops that I follow and am familiar with, some that we've even worked with, really focus a lot of their messaging heavily on being diversified. And they use that diversification as a signal of their strength. And now there's a couple of issues here. One, I'm not convinced that the average co-op is objectively as diversified as they believe they are. And secondly, I'm not sure that diversification is delivering that durable competitive advantage that many people believe that it does. Simply, I'm concerned that co-ops are maybe over-indexed on diversification when perhaps what they mean or what they need is more differentiation. So how does this happen? Well, it flows, I believe, from a series of faulty assumptions that are made about diversification, and then resultingly the value that we assigned to that perceived diversification. And today I'd like to talk through a few of those faulty assumptions with you to help articulate and reveal the real issues that we have here. So faulty assumption number one, I would argue, is that the market values diversification and that diversification is universally good. To dig into this, let's first define diversification. So the operating definition that we will use is diversification is a strategy whereby your company or co-op operates across different markets, products, and services to increase the opportunities for growth while reducing the risk of impact from a downturn in any one of those business lines. So the idea here is that as you simultaneously reduce any sort of concentrated risk exposure, you're also adding avenues for growth. And you're creating a more resilient organization that can withstand external changes in the market and be nimble enough to take advantage of any emerging opportunities as they come. The trouble is that this is not universally or even commonly true in the real world. Diversification alone, in my mind, does not deliver anything approaching a downside-proof agribusiness. Now, the public markets know this, and we've talked about this previously on the podcast, but consider for a moment the conglomerate discount. The conglomerate discount is a principle whereby investors, they often value the collection of businesses and assets in a conglomerate. They value that collection at less than the sum of its parts. So while conglomerates were attractive decades ago, think of the GEs of the world, et cetera, in the modern era, investors and analysts will often suspect that there is captive value in these baskets of assets, baskets of businesses. There's captive value within a large diversified organization, and the only way you can liberate that value is by making it into a subset of smaller, more nimble, and more focused businesses. Now, obviously, agricultural cooperatives are not publicly listed entities, so the conglomerate discount doesn't directly apply, but I think it's a relevant concept for assessing the potential value of diversification. There are a host of other issues with the value that I believe we assign to diversification directly in the context of co-ops. The main two, the first one is the distribution of benefits of diversification is a challenge within a co-op. Co-ops are member-owned organizations, and diversification, and I mean true diversification, which we'll talk about here in a bit, would require you to enter into businesses that may only indirectly or certainly unevenly benefit your membership. This is why, if you think about the average co-op, the nature of them today is, why we call them diversified, they're clustered very tightly around the needs of specific member owners. You offer agronomic advisory services to farmers. You sell those same farmers seeds. You sell them crop fertility and protection products. You might spray their fields. You may provide soil mapping and field sampling and production history data tracking and modeling. You purchase and market their grain. You mill and mix their feed. And you provide, their operations with their liquid fuels and propane and lubricants, et cetera, that they need to function. And so when I think about this, if you have a wholly undiversified customer base, that makes for a very hard business diversification play. And so I think, again, that the distribution of benefits, if you want to focus them on your membership, it makes it hard to really achieve true diversification. And second, I think it's faulty to believe that all members benefit equally from diversification, and that it's incorrect to assume that all members will perceive the value of diversification equally. So there's this burden being a member-owned organization. A truly diversified and optimally run co-op may be well-positioned to pay handsome patronage every single year. But there's a couple of issues here. As you become this large diversified entity, in overly simple terms, patronage is only distributed at certain times of the year. It's episodic. Patronage is, very simple here, net earnings less any capital reinvested in the business and cash to run the business. So that diversification that we're talking about is going to require very broad investment, very broad reinvestment, all of which is going to reduce that pool of potential patronage. And as that patronage is episodically felt, right? It's paid out one time a year. That happens only infrequently, while the membership is going to observe and see and hear about all these new broadly distributed services every single time that they interact with you. Every time they drive past a new facility that they may or may not frequent. Every time they read marketing materials about some new product or service that they might not actually use or have use for within their business. So while this is not usually a primary driver of conflict in co-ops, I do think the lack of conflict suggests that meaningfully real diversification is maybe not happening. Because if it was, we would see much more pressure around, we're making investments in lines of business, things that, yes, may generate revenue, things that, yes, may drive patronage, but my membership is bigger than the patronage that I hope to receive. It's about my member equity, and it's about the value of the products and services that I consume and have access to every single day in my farming operation. So if we have faulty assumption number one is that diversification is universally positive and that the market values it, I hinted at this, but faulty assumption number two that I see is that, we have true diversification. Our industry is chock full of co-ops that highlight their diversification as strengths. It's in their marketing materials, it's on the website, it's on the videos. And the reality is that managing a truly diversified business is a daily, grinding, unyielding challenge. And the lack of ink that has been spilled on how hard it is to run a diversified co-op suggests to me that they're not as diversified as they advertise or they believe themselves to be. If we were that broadly diversified, we would have a lot more literature, a lot more conference topics, a lot more discussion around how do you actually keep these truly diverse and sometimes divergent lines of business working together to create aggregate member value in service of a single overarching strategy. Yes, we talk about the challenges of labor. We talk about the challenges of narrow margins, the asset and capital intensity of our industry, agronomic product pricing pressures, all the logistical challenges, the state of infrastructure, et cetera. But these are the moats of our industry that prevent anyone with a checkbook and a spirit of adventure from opening an elevator, a mill, or an ag retail shop. If diversification is a true durable moat for your business, it would be difficult to replicate. And it would fortify your earnings against volatility in ways that competitors don't enjoy. As a critical competitive advantage, it would be hard, and like I said, an important aspect of your business to manage. Yet managing that diverse portfolio of businesses is not the challenge that rises to the top when I speak to co-op leadership teams or boards. We talk about the cost of labor. We talk about the asset capital intensity. We talk about how we're going to navigate a post-patent product environment. What is the future of ag retail and how do we compete? How do we serve the needs of varying size of memberships? These are the things that we hear about how to run the business. Not a lot around, wow, it's really hard to keep these divergent lines of business working together. So perhaps putting it more bluntly, you could argue that we're suffering from a delusion of perceived diversification across what isn't really underlying it, a highly correlated groups of products, services, and businesses. There may be some credible diversification between specialty feed to dairies and precision ag services to row crop farmers within that same co-op. I will concede that may be true. But many other aspects of that co-op, like grain handling and seed sales, are in reality so correlated in the conditions that drive customer behavior and profitability so as to make the resulting business largely undiversified. Co-ops really need to look at their book of business, commonly things like agronomy, retail, grain, feed, energy, etc., and really be honest with themselves. How truly diversified are we? How effective is that collection of businesses in providing a true buffer against the volatility in the market, which could result in a volatility in earnings? Is it protecting us in the way that we would argue that it is or that it should? Now, but what do you do with this observation? Right? If you look in the mirror, if you really do a clear-eyed assessment here and you say, wow, we really aren't as diversified as we thought we were. If you lack true diversification, does that mean that you need to go out and pursue it and start deploying capital in all sorts of adjacent areas further afield from the core of your historical operations? Maybe, maybe not. This is a nuanced issue in that we can't possibly answer this for you in the abstract. But what is important to know and what is true for everyone is that radical diversification, true diversification, could potentially offer you a suite of new benefits and opportunities, no doubt. But it's also going to expose a number of weaknesses that are latent in your business, particularly within the co-op system. So what do I mean by latent weaknesses, latent risks and exposures? First off, if you had a widely distributed, widely diversified co-op, you're going to very quickly start to identify the gaps in your organizational infrastructure. The things like how do you scale back office functions across multiple lines of business, right? You have an accounting team that does your kind of straight product sales accounting. Then there's grain accounting, hedge accounting. You know, it's kind of as it gets more widely distributed, it's harder to have a common set of back office folks to do it. And as you struggle to have a common back office from an organizational infrastructure perspective, the less valuable that diversification becomes because it's all bringing with it its own unique business process needs. And so beyond back office, I'm thinking about everything around business processes, inventory management, technology and cybersecurity risk, insurance, et cetera, management systems overall. The more diversified you become, the more you're going to expose weaknesses in the process and staffing infrastructure of your organization.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
The second thing that's going to show up is your capital availability, which is likely already constrained, is going to be stretched and stressed even further. true diversification is going to require, new acquisitions, new greenfield or brownfield construction, retrofits of existing infrastructure. And as that becomes considerably wider and more ambitious, as your scope of diversification becomes wider and more ambitious, it's going to become more expensive and harder to fund. I hear often about capital constraints limiting co-ops' ability to invest in things like new rail sidings, maybe another packing line at the feed mill, maybe new application equipment, and how do you cycle through your sprayers. These are things that exist today within the common basket of businesses. And these constraints on capital that exist there would simply amplify if capital allocation now also looked at a broader option set of growth options for the co-op. And then finally, I'd say managerial readiness and cohesion would be stressed. It's hard at times, like I said, to coalesce around a single strategy with the heads of agronomy and grain and feed and energy. It's hard, but it happens, right? Because again, my argument is that those underlying businesses are relatively clustered. They're very localized. They're serving the same profile of customer and member within the geography. Now imagine the challenge of trying to do that if you layer in, cattle feeding operations. Maybe you get into ag equipment, in-field servicing. You start to cannibalize some of the dealerships in your area. Maybe you start to get into enterprise software development. You want to become a software company. You're getting into seed production and R&D. All these things that are outside the confines of traditional co-op. They're all still comfortably within farmer-facing agribusiness, or maybe one step removed from the farm gate. But you could already see the stress in the system by doing this. And so finding and hiring and developing and managing and retaining the talent to run this more radically diversified agribusiness would push the limits. And so again, this really speaks to, I think, is faulty assumption number 2, is that we believe we're actually more diversified than we really are. And the third and final faulty assumption here that I think underpins this diversification myth, if you will, is that diversification is the solution. So let's ask ourselves for a moment, what problem within the context of an ag co-op is diversification meant to solve for? Now, I thought a lot about this and I had several ideas, but I also, as I increasingly do, is I said, okay, here's my list of ideas. Let me go out and have a sparring partner with AI through an LLM and see what they say. And so I got some interesting feedback. And so I blended it with some of the things that I was thinking. And here's some of the main themes I think are important when we say, why would we pursue diversification? The first is market and price risk. That first objective is to insulate the co-op from downside risk that results from pricing fluctuations, market volatility in one area, by operating in other areas that might perform better and thus better distribute the market and price risk. That's a big piece of it, right? We struggle in one area, the market works against us here. We have exposure in a market that maybe doesn't have the same headwinds or might even have tailwinds. So we're going to have profitability elsewhere. The second one that's increasingly important is weather and climate risk. So diversification might be a means of managing that environmental risk and exposure to climatic conditions, which, really points to an argument for geographic diversification so that you're not overly sensitive to a localized set of climate conditions or any particular one growing region or one particular crop. Now, of course, the thing you should be thinking about here is, how diversified are we from a climatic and weather perspective? We work with co-ops that actually have seen some pretty meaningful yield performance variation between the north and south parts of their territory, depending on where the weather bands went through in a particular growing season. But generally speaking, I would say that a lot of co-ops actually do have concentrated weather and climate risk within their co-ops. And so if this is a problem to be solved, then we need to make sure that we actually would have the geographic distribution to make sure that weather and climate risk was effectively managed. Another big one, and this is very closely related to market and pricing risk, is revenue risk, right? Diversification is often intended to create more consistent cash flows throughout a crop year and reduce dependency and reduce exposure to any one stream of income. This will also show up in many ways not just through the types of businesses, but more specifically through vertical integration, right? So if you want to remove your revenue risk, you might see folks moving into more value-added services like processing ag products, getting into bird grow-out farms, cattle feeding operations. Maybe they get into more complex creating and packaging and selling of risk management products, et cetera. So the idea being that the resilience and durable earnings are the expected outcome of having more earning streams in both that legacy commodity part of the value chain as well as the value-added legs. Now, in that example, as folks they pursue more vertical integration, which is something that we do see within the co-op complex, the question you should be asking yourself is if you plant beans and spray beans and receive and store beans, does getting into the bean processing business actually create any meaningful diversification? There's certainly some different, margin structure in crushing beans, but it is all still centered around the economics for a particular commodity. And so that's another example of where we sometimes are trying to move into a diversification of our business, and perhaps we're not nearly as diversified as we believe. And then the final one that I would say is a real driver of diversification, one of the reasons we think it's a solution to what we're trying to do, is member value. There's this argument that diversification helps co-ops serve and attract membership and create the conditions for renewals of membership and sustainable relevance within the membership community. But remember, as we said earlier, real diversification and value to members can often be negatively correlated. So if the more diversified you become, the harder it is to have a cohesive value proposition to membership, then I'm not sure that diversification is a driver of member value in a sustainable way. That could be debated, but it's an observation that I wanted to share. So for me, when I ask the question, what is diversification meant to solve for? It sounds like diversification is about managing risk more than driving growth. It's about market risk, price risk, weather risk, climate risk, revenue risk, membership risk. I don't have data to point to here, but when I hear leaders talk about diversification, they don't really talk about it as much in the context of risk. They talk about it in the context of providing something different to their members. We're a diversified co-op that you can count on, and we're growing. We provide innovative solutions, et cetera. They talk about it as a competitive advantage. They talk about it as something that's difficult to replicate. They talk about something that's to be excited about. I'm not sure that it is a competitive advantage. I'm not sure that it is all that difficult to replicate, given the fact that it's commonly replicated everywhere you look. So what this tells me is that what people have in mind when they say diversification might just be differentiation. Diversification is about the things that you do. Differentiation is about the way that you do them. You diversify in the type of services that you provide, and you differentiate in the level of service your customers receive and the value that accrues to them when they choose to do business with you. You differentiate on technology aptitude and adoption. You can differentiate on competence of staff, on proprietary offerings, on maybe some bespoke or unique collaborations that you secure with your supply chain partners that provide different kinds of services and value to your customers. Differentiating those kinds of factors earns you more of the customer's business, and more of that business may also be able to command a premium, which is a smart defense against the commodification of your business within the ag industry. But it's not diversification, right? Diversification doesn't help you command a premium. Diversification doesn't guarantee more share of wallet from that customer. Diversification doesn't mean that they have a different service experience with you compared to the folks down the road. That's differentiation. So today's episode is not a takedown on diversification or a celebration of differentiation, though I would say that the former is probably an optional tactic available to you, but it's not enough on its own. While the latter being differentiation, is always going to deliver some benefit, often quite outsized benefit. So as we come to a conclusion for today, I want to tie this together. My point is that if you put emphasis on diversification of your agribusiness, if that's what you're talking about now, if that's what you intend to talk about in the future, if that's something you believe is a competitive advantage for your organization, you have to get crisp on these three things that we talked about today. The first is diversification definitively better for the business and for our customers? Does the benefit that it drives extend to our members if you're a co-op, right? Does the market value this diversification? Second, and really important here, is are we truly diversified as a collection of non or lightly correlated lines of business? Or do we simply perceive ourselves as such? Because if you look at the customers that you transact with, and you think about the conditions that will drive their kinds of purchasing behavior, whether it's purchasing products or services, and the needs that they have in different economic environments, you might find an uncomfortable amount of concentration within your customer base that, while what it takes to run a grain business versus a feed business versus a propane business are quite different, you find that, man, the folks that we're serving are so concentrated that these businesses aren't nearly as diversified as we thought. And you need to be very clear about what your true level of diversification is, because if you're relying upon it as a defense, it ought to be a credible defense. And finally, that question around what problem you're trying to solve. Ask, what are we optimizing for when we talk about diversification? Is it assessed on factors that are derived from market and revenue risk, which is how diversification is technically defined? And if you are, that's great. If you're looking to manage risk and you have a truly diversified portfolio, that's great. But if you're pointing at something that's more aspirational, if you're pointing towards something that helps you differentiate from the competition and offer something new that no one else can, then I would say diversification is not what you're actually looking for. But you need to go back and refresh and do that hard work to say, okay, what is our competitive advantage? What is our strategy we're going to build around that? So there's no universal right or wrong here, but you do have to be clear about what you want to be in order for it to be additive in any sort of meaningful way. Thank you for listening to the program and today's podcast. We always appreciate you take your time to spend with us today. We don't take it for granted, and I hope that it was of value to you. If it was, please consider sharing this episode with others who you feel would find similar benefit from it in their agribusiness. And as always, I look forward to having you join us next time right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.